Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, friends, thanks so much for joining us again for this conversation today on the podcast. I'm really honored to have with me all the way from Durham, North Carolina, Dr. Emily Smith. Emily, thanks for being with me today.
Thank you for having me. This is fun.
You know what? It is fun, and I'm excited because there's a million and one things I know I could learn from you and our listeners as well. Listeners, if you have never explored the field of epidemiology, you're
Yeah.
about to get a wonderful crash course in that very subject today. But I have learned a lot from Emily from reading some of the things that she's written, and we're going to be exploring some of that together today. But Emily, I don't want to take too much more time. I'd love for us just to kind of dive right in the middle. Let's begin with you, 20 years old,
Yeah.
on a plane, flying to Honduras to join and serve with Mercy Ships. And people might need the Coles Notes on what Mercy Ships is, but how did that adventure come about? And what were some of the really formative consequences of that experience in your life?
Yeah. I love that opening question. Well, first, it throws me back 20 years, which is kind of funny to say, right? Isn't it? That's half my life ago. Who was that, Emily? It makes me a bit
Mm,
teary to
yeah.
think that because I've always been very idealistic and
Hmm,
joyful. I just love I'm very curious, and so I think that's made me love the world.
yeah.
I just grew up loving God. I grew up
Mm,
in church. My parents were worship leaders in a charismatic church, and so we were in church a lot, and I loved it. It wasn't one of those experiences where you were made to go and now you resent,
mm,
all of
yeah.
that. That can be some people's experience, and that was not mine. And so I'm really fortunate to have that. But I've just loved him. I've loved
Mm.
journaling, but I also remember being in kindergarten, and I wanted to be Sandy Patty, a singer. Do you know Sandy Patty?
Yeah, I feel like I'm like reaching back, but like I feel
It's
like 90s Sandy Patty was like doing great things.
Oh, it's way 90s, yeah. I mean, she was like Twyla Paris. I mean, this is charismatic Maranatha stuff.
Yes.
But I also wanted to be a missionary. I just loved
Mm,
the world, and we were the home where missionaries that would come and visit the church, and they would stay at our house. I'd get kicked out of
yeah.
my room, which was
Mm,
totally fine,
you're
but
kind.
oh, yeah, why not? And I would always just ask them questions like, "Where are you in the world?
Mm,
Tell me anything you want." I just didn't care. Like, tell me what you eat and what the ground looks like. I just loved it.
yeah.
So fast forward through high school, and yeah, I just grew up in a really tiny town in southeastern New Mexico where there wasn't a whole lot of any extra programs. I mean, there's typical
Mm,
band and stuff, but not like what my kids have now. And I thought the only way to do missionary and science, because I loved science. So this is a good outing of me being as nerdy as possible.
there you go.
Yeah, I mean, ninth grade, my teacher talked about DNA, and I was like, "What is this magic? And how do
This
I
is
learn?"
amazing.
Yeah, and he handed me a textbook for college, and I just read it because it's what you do when you're nerdy and hungry.
You got handed a college textbook on
Yeah,
DNA as a 13, 14-year-old in grade 9, and you're like, we're going to read this 500-page
let's
tome
go.
right now.
Yeah, I didn't
Wow.
know. I mean, he didn't tell me he was a good teacher and sneaky and didn't
Mm.
tell me, "Let's get even more nerdy," and I read it on a band trip. So, double nerd.
And
Band
double tasking. Good on you.
Thank you very much. So I was pre-med because I wanted to do something for the Lord, but I also just loved science.
Yeah.
And then this brings me to Honduras because I was pre-med all through undergrad. And when I went to Honduras, I'd heard about poverty. You read about it. I I just read a whole lot about missionaries growing up, but I hadn't seen it up hand. And
Hmm.
I worked on the Mercy ships for a month. And the Mercy ships is it's just a big medical mission boat, or a medical mission ship. Let me say that it's not a boat, a big.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very big boat.
It's a very big boat, but those
Yes.
Mercy shippers will be like, "It's a ship." I can hear them yelling at us.
Yes.
Um, and I worked in the kitchen because that's all I could do,
Hmm.
but which was fine, making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But on my off days, I could go out to the remote parts where they did, um, like a medical clinic. We'd go really far away, and I just remember a couple things. One is the poverty. Couldn't speak the
Hmm.
language, but I just
Hmm.
remember watching and being very aware. I also remember thinking that I'm asking questions not about treating one-on-one type of people, but asking bigger population level questions. So why is this area so poor? Why are certain demographics of people coming in with really advanced diabetes? And I didn't know it at the
Hmm.
time, but those are epidemiology questions.
Right.
And so I think the Lord just used that experience, one, to just break me of
Hmm.
this is what I want to do. Almost seeing if I don't embrace my identity or what I can contribute in the world as a Christian, I will miss this. But then
Hmm.
also those big population level questions. So when I came home, I was still pre-med, took the MCAT, got into med school, and got married to my pastor husband. His first job was all the way across the country in South Carolina. So I had a gap year.
Hmm.
And I decided, well, why not just do another degree? Because that's what us nerds do to get into medical school.
Hey, 100%.
I know. And that's where I got into public health. Day one of epidemiology, my professor said, epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of disease. That's the technical
Hmm.
Jeopardy term. But he said for him, it's an equity question of
Hmm.
quantifying who is most at risk of something and then choosing not to walk by. And it just hit me that that's the science of the Good Samaritan, and never went to med school, got my PhD instead. And the rest is history.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and you're living that adventure and that journey. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you could, for a second, Emily, double click on that, what you said a second ago about the element of epidemiology being about equity,
Yeah.
because for me and potentially for other listeners, when people start hearing that initial definition you gave, I know I want to kind of put it in the academic box in my
Mhm.
brain, kind of be like, oh, here's a cool stat that now I know. And like if this pops up somewhere else, I'll have an idea of what's going on. But I'm not drawing clear lines between my own privilege as somebody living in Canada with access to tremendous healthcare, clean water, et cetera, and not just someone on the other side of the world, but also other people in my own country, but especially not just other people around the world, but the vast majority of the world's population. So, can I ask, how did your love for advocating for that kind of equity, medical care, clean water, et cetera, how did that begin to create this passion in you for epidemiology? Because if you're going to do a PhD in this, like it's not your head's not just in this, your heart is really in this. So
Yeah.
tell us about that.
I just think I've always been drawn to the margins. Uh,
Hmm.
and probably that's just growing up in the church and hearing the stories of Jesus. And I remember understanding, or not understanding, but recognizing, um, Jesus like stopped entire crowds because of bleeding women that have spent
Hmm.
all their money. I mean, she spent all her money for a medical issue, and she touched him. She tried to sneak in and touch the hem of his robe, and he stopped everybody.
Hmm.
Or he centers the little child. Like, he's got a different center and focus on marginalized groups and people, that I think I've just always loved and wanted to do something with and for. So with epidemiology, the once you start looking at nearly every single disease or every single, we think of the intersection of poverty and health,
Hmm.
or climate change, poverty and health. I mean, all these things compound on each other like building blocks. The problems are almost exclusively in the margins. And so
Hmm.
that people with the compounding effects of inequity on environmental justice, on economics, on health, food insecurity are always in the margins.
Mm,
So epi is an equity issue just because that's where you're going to find where the problems are. And to me, I'm sure we'll talk about my own work in Somaliland, but it's the margins of the margins of the margins. Like you keep
mm,
going further in and you realize that compounding just gets multiplicative. And so do the solutions to try to get there. So I just think inherently it's an equity issue because it's a disease, what makes people more susceptible type. And most of the time it's not um, wealthy people or wealthy nations. Not to say
yes.
that we don't have problems, but the compounding effects of inequities are mostly on the margins.
Hmm. Hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think Somaliland has been in the news just this week,
Yes.
signing a deal with Ethiopia to give them sea access. And
Yes.
Somalia has been very angry about it all. So it's
Right.
like, here's this little opportunity to do something that might help your mutually beneficial agreement. And at the same time, it could throw you into political upheaval. Hopefully not.
Right.
But
And north of the Sea of Somaliland is Yemen. And so it's very much in the news now.
yes, if you don't know, isn't it? It's Houthi rebels in Yemen who are shelling cargo ships associated with Israel. So it's a fragile part of the globe. We'll
Sure.
put it
Yeah.
that way. Yeah, 100%. So, Emily, people are listening in now. We've just brought up some stats about what's going on globally, and they're probably just thinking they may be tempted to think this is way too big. This is
Hmm.
massive. I don't even know where I could or would begin. And I'm sorry for this. It sounds sad, but like it just feels overwhelming.
Yeah.
And something I appreciated in your writing is that you love to zero in on the lives of specific individuals who have gone ahead of you and inspired you, shown you the way, given you this sense of like, this is what it could look like to step towards this kind of equity, to step towards serving people on the margins. And for two people that are in really unique spaces, one, the cellist and musician, Yo-Yo Ma,
Yeah.
but also Edna Adan Ismail and her work as well are two people that I know that you've said, oh, I've just been profoundly shaped by them. And I know for me, it really helps me when having these conversations that are complex and heavy. And sometimes I feel like utterly incompetent in the midst of them to say, okay, who's someone who's gone ahead, who's cast a vision by their example, led by example, that I can learn from and in many ways draw from what they've done and apply it in my own life. So could you speak to their formative influence in your life
Yeah.
for the sake of helping our listeners consider how we might learn from those who have gone before us as well?
Yeah, the Great Hall of Faithers, isn't it? Or I think I wanted to put that in there
Mm,
because acting like a good Samaritan is hard work. And it's not, if you read the book, it has three parts: centering, cost, and courage. The longest part is the first part of centering, because being a good Samaritan is not, here's top 10 steps to how to love your neighbors. Those books are out there and they're great. Mine is more of the heart work. It's
mm,
being a Samaritan. And I think that if I can make this answer a little longer,
absolutely.
go back to the story of the Good Samaritan. Like, a lot of us have grown up with it, and
Hmm.
so we're familiar with it. But I started reading it a little bit more, and a couple things struck out. So there's a man who came up to Jesus and said, basically, "Who's my neighbor?" Now, we
Right.
don't know his voice inflection. We don't know if he is like a gotcha type, or if he's
Hmm.
really asking, like, "Who is my neighbor?" I don't know. Um, but being Jesus, he doesn't answer with an answer. He answers either with a parable and a question. And in this story, he does both. He says, there's a man on the side of the road who's really sick. And he's sick enough where he can't get up and help himself at all.
Mm,
Two people walk by, and I'm struck by the writer's details on that story, because we're told they were the religious leaders at the time. And I'm married to a pastor, so this is not about, all religious leaders are bad. But at the time, those two men that walked by, they were significant in power and privilege. That's just who
mm,
they were. And then a Samaritan walks by and stops. And he not only stops, he bandages the man up, he
yeah.
takes him to a place like a hotel to recover, and then he pays for all of it. And that part, I've told this story, I don't know how many times at this point, but I still get really teary on that part. Like he pays for it all. Not only that, he says, whatever you've paid before, let me know and I'll still reimburse you for that.
Mm, mm,
It's this extravagant neighboring. So then Jesus turns around to the original man and said, "Now who was the neighbor?" And if
right,
we're not careful, we don't see the difference between those two questions. Who is my neighbor and who was the neighbor? To
right.
me, the first one is like this, what is good enough to be good enough? Can I just give 10% and then donate food for a food pantry, volunteer every once in a while at my church or some other place that needs help? And I think all of that is yes. It's the and also be a neighbor
Mm,
on a normal Tuesday. What do you do with the rest of your money? What are the words that come out of your mouth during an election season when people are being sneaky, bigoted or racist?
mm,
That's the end also of who was the neighbor. And so the first part of that book is on how do we become people of bringing heaven on earth as neighboring, but just instantly stop, like snap your fingers. You just stop like that Samaritan did and helped, where the
mm,
others walked by. Like there had to have been something intrinsically in him to make him stop and then make him extravagantly give of himself, his time, his money, to help that man. So that's where I bring up Yo-Yo Ma at the very beginning of the book, because I played the piano growing up, but I've always wanted to play the violin. So I decided let's go
mm.
for it in college. Bless it. I mean, I feel very sorry for my uh, friends hearing like hot cross buns. It was awful. And I went to New York for a summer and worked in upper state. And someone walked on the stage. This is an open air concert, just an idyllic type scene at dusk. I didn't know who he was at the time, but it's only him. And he walks out and he just starts playing that uh, sweet cello. Oh, I can't remember the. Anyways, y'all will look it up. You'll know it when you hear it. And
Mm,
then we're just mesmerized. And I turned to my
mm,
friend and said, "Who is that?" And she said, "It's Yo-Yo Ma."
mm,
Course, I mean, he is the greatest cellist of the time. And for me, looking back on that, I realized I was asking the first question as a violinist: what is good enough to be good enough? How can I just kind of play for Christmas? He was living a life of being a cellist where he just walked on stage and just
mm,
playing. During when he got his COVID vaccine, he just played during the 15 minutes in the
mm.
subway
Wow.
system, he just
Wow.
plays. Yeah,
Yeah.
for Gaza and Palestine and Israel, he just plays. So he lives something intrinsically as a cellist where it just comes out of him. And I
Hmm.
think that's the difference between those two questions.
Mm. Wow. That's beautiful. Sorry, a second ago you mentioned Israel and Gaza and Palestine. Has he gone there to play and in some way seek?
No, he just played and uploaded kind of a dedication to them, the
Yes. Right.
children and stuff. It was beautiful.
Wow. Wow,
Yeah.
wow, wow. I'll have to check that out. So, but beautiful and compelling because what you're saying is it's not like he has his life and sometimes he plays the cello, but like this passion and love for music is something that he's actively investing in and expressing on a
Yeah, his
daily
whole
basis.
life is
Yeah.
that being so at any point he just plays and people
Mm,
are enamored. Like
mm.
people stop. And I mean, I think when we neighbor well, people see that
Yes.
they stop and they know it's very different than, the evangelical space where there's just too much yelling, I think.
Mm.
I think the act of neighboring is
No.
kind of an antidote to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I still remember Tim Keller hearing a sermon by him on the Good Samaritan and realizing this isn't like for myself how I'd seen it just as like this is a good thing to do for people in need, but him drawing the connection to say the Samaritan is, this representation of Christ
Yeah.
stepping into our brokenness and our need and our reality and putting everything on the line to see us restored. And that's been really inspirational for me as I seek to live in that way. But
Yeah.
speaking of Good Samaritans, um, could you touch on as well Edna Adan
Yes.
Ismail? and her story, because I'd never heard of her until I read The Science of the Good Samaritan. But it sounds like as they say in hockey circles, the gal is a weapon, i.e., she's like doing great things and making a huge difference for people out there who haven't heard that phrase before. But how has her example formed your understanding of serving people on the margins? What's she about? What's she done? And how is she making a difference in the world?
Edna is the epitome of a good Samaritan, more than anybody else ever. She has taught me what it looks like to live a life of neighboring and extravagance. And so when I was getting my master's in epidemiology, I saw the PBS documentary called Half the Sky. If you haven't
Mm.
seen it, and there's a book on it too, but the premise is women hold up half the sky. And so they go to these incredibly strong and powerful women all across the globe that are just doing really great things for equity. And Edna was one of them. So I saw her, and I was just like, well, she's the girl boss that I would love to be one day. And
Boom.
you never heard of Somaliland? Um, or just really that part of the country I didn't know a lot about. So fast forward when I got my PhD, and I was at one of my first conferences after I graduated in DC, and someone goes to the stage and starts talking, and then I realized, oh my gosh, that's Edna. So not we're just in the same room at this point. So I got up the courage after she was done to just go up and kind of, I don't remember, I probably said something really bad of like, or really nervous, of I just love you and can I take a selfie? I think I had something very cool and that nothing came out except that. So the picture is hilarious because it is just me starstruck. Later on in that conference, I finally got up the nerve to go again and just ask her, look, I'm an epidemiologist. Is there anything I can do for your country? And she said, yeah, we need to quantify basically the children who need care, any type of health care, mainly surgical care, because that's some of the hardest people to reach, and the hardest conditions to treat when you think of like congenital conditions. And I said, okay, and didn't know what that was. I was just like, I'm saying yes to whatever this woman tells me to do. And so that has started a 7 or 8 year journey with her where we've quantified the need in all 6 regions of the country with a team of 15 Somali, either midwives or medical students under her care, to try to find the children of the children of the children, like the margins of the margins who need the most help. And granted, this is in the part of the world where we couldn't go to certain regions because of terrorists. It borders Somalia, and so there's the unrest there. But the country itself is a relatively very stable democratic society. I mean, they have their own elections.
Mm-hmm.
So Edna's granddad was one of the first founders of the country. Her dad was one of the most prominent doctors. She was not given the opportunity to go to school though, because she was a woman. And so dad hired a tutor for the boys in the compound, with knowing that she would be listening at the door and learning right alongside them. So she was the first Somali woman to go in Europe and get a midwife degree. She's the first woman of the country because she married the next president. And then she worked for the WHO for years and years and years. 60, she decided to take out her entire pension, move back to her country, and build a hospital off of that pension.
Wow.
And so she lives there now. Like she spent everything to build this hospital, and the only plot of land that they would give her is the city dump. It was the no man's land. It's also some incredibly ruthless land where there was like a genocide that happened.
Oh,
And so she
wow.
said, sure. Yeah, because she realized that that part was no man's land, but it is also right next door to the women that were hemorrhaging the most during childbirth because they
Wow.
access care. Like it is
Yeah.
next to poverty. It is the margins of the margins. And she said, this is where we're going.
Yeah.
So she built her hospital. And Edna just, and we are a very two different religions. She is 85. She's more than double my age. Like we could not be as opposite as possible, but we both neighbored together in a way that I think shows solidarity. It shows what we can
Mm,
do. Like there were welcome arms from both sides to help.
yeah.
Um, but she's just showed me neighboring. I mean, she
Yeah.
just did it all and is still there, 85 and going strong.
Mm,
She's amazing. If you don't know who she is, just YouTube her TED Talk and just watch her.
yeah. And I understand the hospital is thriving and doing
Yeah,
incredibly effective work today. Is that right?
it is. It is.
Yeah.
It's state of the art solar panels, and
Mm,
she's just bringing. I mean, it still needs a lot of work and a lot of money because, unfortunately, Somaliland does not get a lot of the aid that Somalia
mm,
does,
mm.
as it's not recognized as it's
Right.
independent, right?
Hmm.
And that goes way back. We can talk about that. If we want. But yeah, it for what it is though, it is state of the art and providing care to women that otherwise, would have died in childbirth.
Yeah. Which is massive and beautiful and compelling. So thank you. I so appreciate you taking the time to not just write about Yo-Yo Ma and Edna, but also to articulate their influence in your life. And in your own way, Emily, you've had compelling influence in your own country and spheres of influence, but it's not always been well received. And so the next questions, it's like a doozy of a question, so you're welcome to tackle it from whichever angle you choose. But during the pandemic, actually, well, even before the pandemic, as an epidemiologist, you were like, several red flags are in the air, like, heads up, this is coming.
Right.
This has some pretty big implications. And kind of like Yo-Yo Ma playing his music, blessing people in different contexts, you launched a social media page on Facebook, The Friendly Neighbor Epidemiologist. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, 100%. And it's, for your mom, for a few people in
Yeah.
your immediate sphere of influence, and it takes off, like blows up in beautiful, exciting, and potentially incendiary ways. And so, can you speak to this? Because you're not going viral because of your dance moves
Hmm.
or something like that a lot of other people
Right.
go viral for. You're going viral because you have a PhD in what you're talking about. And it's in a time where, due to a unique crisis, people are paying a ton of attention to what's being said about health, viruses, etc. And so, can you speak to that reality of going viral on social media on something that you're legitimately professionally trained in? But not only that, then facing some pretty harsh backlash,
Yeah.
not just from people in random places, but people in your own community, in your own church. And out of that, going through burnout and then having to pursue that healing and finding new havens in the midst of all that. Again, I realize that's a doozy of a question. So take it from whatever angle you want, but I feel like it's so consequential to who you are today and what you're writing and what you're advocating for.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to put that section in the book. That's the middle section on cost, because
Hmm.
we center our lives on the people that Jesus centered on. And, we say no to oppressive systems and structural violence and these health inequities that I've talked about in the centering part. It comes at a cost, and I was not prepared for it. And so I hope that people's are not as dramatic as mine, but it will cost something. And so I
Mm.
just want to be open about it. At the same time, I was hesitant to put some of this stuff in because I didn't want it to be like a tell-all memoir, which is
Yes.
it. Yeah. And so if you read it, you will likely see how jumbled those two chapters are. It's just two chapters for cost. When I was reading the audiobook, I noticed it too, that this just feels like a whirlwind, and I didn't get the paragraph structures correct, but I just threw it on the page. And so that's kind of how the time was. So at the beginning of 2020, when we were hearing, these whispers that was what was happening at Wuhan, as an epidemiologist, we have studied this forever. I mean, this is what we're trained for, to look at these signs. And,
Mm,
we've had epidemics happen before, like the horrific Ebola um, in in Western Africa that happened and killed thousands of thousands.
mm,
That was awful. And so we were just trained to recognize it. When Wuhan started happening, a lot of us were going, uh-oh, because it's different than Ebola. When Ebola is horrific, but when it spreads, you know pretty much that someone is sick. Like it's,
Yes.
with COVID or with whatever's happening at Wuhan, it looked like it was sneakier. And so
Mm.
that means that it might have been respiratory or airborne or, contagious before people know that they're sick, which is now we know is true. So I was speaking at two conferences, one a medical missions conference and then one at university. And I was getting asked a lot about Wuhan and what to do. And then when I get home, my real life neighbors and family were like, what does flatten the curve mean? And
Mm.
should I really be buying 5 billion things of toilet paper? But you could hear it was a scary time. And I want to
Mm.
honor that because I think we forget how scary of a time it was, especially for very high risk populations.
Mm.
And so I started that Facebook page really for the 20 people that I knew in real life that were asking. I named it Friendly because I just tend to be too friendly at times, but Neighbor because of the Good Samaritan story. Because if
Mm.
it really was going to be something that was going to spread prior to us knowing who was sick, airborne, it was going to hit the margins. And so
Mm.
those that were already at risk of poverty or healthcare access, we're going to be hit the most, which is not
Yeah.
a lot of us in America or the North America. Um, so I wanted to name it Neighbor too, because as a Christian, I felt this was going to be our time as the Big C church to come together
Mm.
and show what protecting our neighbors look like. I just was so idealistic about that. And so at the beginning, it was just like teaching what does flatten the curve mean. My kids and I made a video with Hot Wheels on here's what that means to try to help
Nice.
the little kids that were like, why can't we see grandma? We had to take it down because of security, but it was just talking to moms and dads at that point, like stock up on your Tylenol just in case, but leave some food for people, that needed food in the
Mm.
grocery stores. Like don't hoard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then, my husband's a pastor. And so I was talking a lot to pastors on don't open your church just yet. This won't be
Mm.
forever, but here's
Mm.
how to think through that. And then, at least here in the States, when it became political, it was this weird, like, conundrum of evangelical politics, freedom over fear. Don't
Mm.
mask because I have freedom in Jesus. And I was like, hold up, I think you wear a mask because of that freedom. So I was speaking against it.
So I'm just laughing because I don't know if you know the name Shane Claiborne, but
Oh, for
he
sure.
he
Yes.
jokes. He says, uh, "I just not to make this more contentious or anything, but he was talking to somebody who was like packing a gun while he's talking to him, and the guy was like, "I don't need to wear a mask.
Yeah.
Jesus will protect me." He was like, "Great. Why do you need a gun?"
Yeah.
I just was like, it's just
That's right.
classic Shane. But I
Yeah.
think about that all the time. So,
Or
anyways,
why do you
back to
wear a
you.
seatbelt? Yeah. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove for
Yeah.
with Shane, he wrote an endorsement, a lovely endorsement of my book. It's on the
Mm.
very back. And just kind of pinch myself on it. But my first viral post was when I wrote the Faith Over Fear. Like this is
Mm.
how we show true faith, like loving our
Mm.
neighbors, protecting, living Galatians 5 and praying Psalm
Yeah.
91 is what the ending was. And that went over awesome. And
Hmm.
I was not prepared, nor is my personality one that loves getting into the ring and just
Mm.
um and so what we started getting after that were some pretty horrific threats, online ones, which are awful, that I kept posting because I thought at some point this is going to end, the pandemic and the threats. Neither did, and the site would grow to about 10 million people, a reach of that over that year and a half period of time. Um, and I think the breaking point was when we got one at our house written in black and red marker. And it was fraught with like Mark of the Beast stuff, stuff about my children.
Mm.
It is one thing to receive pictures of guns and Holocaust imagery and stuff online from just random people. And I still sent that to big authorities because that's what you need to do. It's another thing to get stuff right outside your house where your kids, I mean, it's during the
Yeah.
pandemic. They play in the front all the time.
Yeah. Someone has tracked down exactly where you live.
It was
Yeah.
it was shattering.
Yeah.
And then like what you alluded to get some things from people at our church that were just horrific. I still don't quite understand that. And it's not who you would expect, like people you see
Mm.
in the news. It's normal 30, 40-year-old moms like me. It
Mm.
was it was bizarre.
Yeah. And
Um,
can we just pause real quick to say, and lest any listeners veer into the space of saying, well, we all had opinions on the pandemic, which is true. You have your PhD in epidemiology. You've learned from, connected with, partnered with some of the foremost leaders in the space in the world. You've presented before the UN
yeah.
on this matter. And correct me if I'm wrong, have you done any work with the WHO as well?
No, no,
Not yet.
not
Gotcha.
yeah, not yet.
But you hang out with them sometimes, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
you're a leading figure in this field. You're not
Right.
just somebody who like watched a couple YouTube videos and decided you're an expert.
Right.
So, what you're injecting into a public space to be interacted with and consumed, your writing, your videos, etc., is more fully informed than 99% of the world. So I just throw that in there because it's not like, as they say, you're not cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, like you know what you're talking about. So, anyways,
Yeah.
back to you. Let's just to ground this whole conversation. You're an expert at this.
Yeah. That was very weird to not be trusted. I mean, political leaders matter how they speak about people like us too. And here in the States, it was not given the trust and that was needed. I mean, it was just like a maelstrom of
Hmm.
politics, power, privilege, just anti anything equity. Some of
Hmm.
the worst things I would get was when I would publish something about equity from church leaders and pastors. It was so it will take me years, I think, to disentangle all of that. Um, but at about the 15-month point of just, my husband, we left that church. We had to move. We were in Texas at the time, so we were at a mega church at the heart of evangelical culture in the heart of Texas. And so all of that just changed very, very quickly. And at about 15 months, my body just said no more. And
Hmm.
usually I'm a very high capacity type person.
Hmm.
Um, but it just something broke. And that started about an 18-month, almost being bedridden. I'm certainly bedridden for 6 months of that, just with a migraine that would not stop.
Hmm.
I never experienced anything health wise. I've been very fortunate
Hmm.
until then, but so it's taken a long time to recover from that. And so those two chapters tell those story because I just want people to know, count the cost if you're going to live like a neighbor and not ask the what's good enough to be good enough question. It will
Hmm.
cost something. It could cost friends, certainly
Hmm.
security, maybe bank account security, but I just wanted to be very open about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a courageous journey to embark on, and I recognize that it has cost a lot that people outside of your immediate circles probably can't fully appreciate the consequence of. But you're saying, yeah, okay, I had a crash course in counting the cost, but I sense from what you wrote that you want to be the kind of person that says, I want to be willing to be generous with my life,
Yeah.
to serving people on the margins. And I know that you, with that in mind, have written a lot about solidarity. And well,
Yeah.
Dr. Farmer, who's shaped your perspective on that as well. And so I wonder if you could speak to that a bit, that reality of, because let's be honest, you could have you could have just turned a blind eye, like you could have been silent.
Yeah.
You had that option, but you didn't. You waded into the maelstrom, as you said. And so, but I know that part of that is your heartbeat to be in solidarity with people who don't have that same voice or the same access to supports as you do. So could you help us understand how solidarity is essential to the vitality of our presence and the health of any community that we participate in.
Yeah. Well, and that's the last part of the book is
Mm,
on courage. That's the last C, like a good Baptist pastor, isn't it? Centering cost and courage. Because out of coming of, well, a couple things that happened out of coming out of that awful
mm,
cost season, and still in some ways being in it because of the cost. I, though, have found probably I feel more myself than I have ever felt. And
mm,
that is because of neighboring. And that's because
mm,
of taking some of the risk and losing community and all of that stuff that we went through, but also finding another one. And so I just want to encourage people that there is a cost, but there is a and also to that cost.
mm.
Like
Yeah.
it might not all be redeemed this side of heaven. That's, that's just part of faith, but a lot of it is. And I think if, especially with the new year, like if people are feeling that um itch to be who they were meant to be, I would say give neighboring a try, because at least for me, that is who has made me stand up with courage I didn't even know that I had.
Mm,
um so I say that with the solidarity part because solidarity is hard. That word I never heard about until I met Dr. Paul Farmer that I talk about in the book. I just, along with Edna, he has been pivotal to many of us in
mm,
mental health, but me personally, just from his faith perspective. But he signed a book for me and he wrote In Solidarity, Paul. And I was thinking, what in the world? How can he think that I'm in solidarity with him? I mean, he is a boss and I'm just a student. And so I started looking at that word a little bit more. And I think it is the essence of the Good Samaritan story, because it means you're walking with somebody. Like there's a witness, a WITH that is like a witness, sure.
oh yeah.
So yeah, there's a walking beside someone that looking over and you notice if they don't have food and you do, you just share. If
Mm,
you don't have shoes and they do, they will likely help somehow. And
mm,
that happens when we are walking in a posture of neighboring instead of power.
mm,
Even instead of sneaky privilege, like unconscious bias that a lot of us have if we grew up in the States or kind of in privileged
yeah.
societies, whatever that
Mm-hmm.
looks like. And we have to disentangle that. And so solidarity, I think, is disentangling that, but also walking one-on-one with people so you can hear them. You can like pass the microphone and
Mm-hmm.
just ask the question, how can I be a neighbor? Or just watch and listen and then be one.
Mm, mm. Yeah, well said. I wonder, yeah, if we could zoom in on that, what you said a second ago, just about, you know, for those who live in contexts where they have, ready access to medical support, ready access to good education, transportation, food, drinking water, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. That's not something obviously for anyone to feel guilty about or ashamed of.
Yeah.
But I know for me, my temptation is to be honest, to not just take it for granted, but to kind of be entitled that
Mm,
that is a normative way of life. And if I'm not intentionally, not just paying attention to, but seeking to aid in some way people that are in context, well, that where that's not the normative way of life, that's the anomaly, that I not only lose sight of how I can make a difference in the world, but I get really bent out of shape when the Wi-Fi in McDonald's is slow.
sure.
And so I just wonder, when you think about empowering people, challenging people, inspiring people who are in those really privileged contexts and have so many resources at their fingertips to turn around and say, how can I, inject my life into these parts of the world? What are some of the really simple but practical things they can do to help form their own viewpoints and their
Yeah.
own heart on the matter, to cause them to, yeah, to that space where you're pursuing heart change, if that makes
Yeah.
sense, to say, I don't just know about the need in Somaliland, but I actually really care. And these are the rhythms of life I'm embracing in Texas or British Columbia or London, England, that are forming me in that way.
I love that question because that gets back to the centering part.
Mm,
I wish that I could have had a chapter in here on those top 10. Here's how you do it on a practical level. And I kind of have that, at least for families, at the end of the book. especially for kiddos, which I thought was fun. So just some things that I did with mine,
Mhm.
but change is harder. And so the first thing I think to do is not talk and listen.
Mm.
And I
Mhm.
do a lot of that through reading. I just read all the time. But
Yeah.
I've been last year and the year before, I've been very cognizant on who I'm reading, where's the author from, and trying to be more diverse on
Mhm.
voices and the Bible that is written from the Native American perspective. The opening story of Genesis is just beautiful. And so
Mm.
hearing that changes us. And if do we have time if I share two stories about that?
Oh, yeah. Keep going.
Okay. One of them, where I think once we learn about people and learning, I think learning on a heart change is the solidarity. Like, how do we walk hand in hand and side by side with people in
Mhm.
our heart? When I had my second child, at about a month prior, I started like losing my vision. It was very
Mhm.
weird. And so I called the
Yeah.
doctor. I was like, this is weird, right? And she said, yeah, you kind of need to come in right now. So I went in, I had no idea. I had no
Right
idea.
now.
Yeah. I mean, number one was fine, like perfect,
Mm.
fortunate for that. And so she admitted me, and it turned out I had very severe preeclampsia. So she came
Mm.
and she said, you just need to walk down the hall and we're having this baby right now. And so,
Wow.
yeah. Um, and so we had him, and it was even after that, my blood pressure I was in the hospital multiple times with like stroke level blood pressure. He was in the NICU for jaundice. I mean, it was really scary, but we had the money to afford to go back to the hospital every time. The
Mm.
hospital was right down the road for me. We had parents around who could help care for the oldest, and so my husband could go with me to the hospital, or Jonathan, the son. And so I say all that of it's like this uh, beautiful way of what the world maybe should look like.
Mm.
I had a nest egg. I didn't have any worry about delays to care because I knew if we get there and insurance didn't pay for it, most of the time we can pay for
Mhm.
it. If you or if you go like Google Earth around the world to Burundi, this is a beautiful landlocked country that I work in Africa, very small. The same equivalent of a mom, she already has a kid of her own, a month out, preeclampsia hits, but she can't get to care. Like she has to walk to care. She's 8, 9 months pregnant. Statistically, she will not make it, and nor will her baby, of no fault of her own.
Yeah.
The fault is the systems and the structures around her, including historical poverty. And
Mhm.
so I think understanding those sorts of systems and structures and stories and statistics helps us not shame people, and also not shame countries. If you,
Mm.
my book, I think it's in chapter 4, it talks about one of my favorite stories in 1885, where 14 men were around this huge horseshoe table, and they all represented
Mm.
14 countries. I don't know if you
Yeah.
remember the story. At
Mhm.
the back of the room was this massive picture of Africa. And at the end of that meeting, the point was to splice and dice the continent for colonialism of basically what country is going to take what. And the countries were cut up in ways where if you look at like Lake Victoria, it looks like someone just put a pencil and just drew all the way straight down it.
Mm.
Obviously, the men had not been in the country. No one from Africa was represented. The Sultan of Zanzibar asked to come and wasn't given entry. So 10% of the nationalities, the ethnic groups, the original organic makeup of the country was cut up because of that colonialism. And we all know the story of what happened there, ruthless.
Mm.
Even when they got their independence, though, so when you're fast forwarding to Burundi and Somaliland, they were one of the countries that were colonized by two different places and spliced and diced. Those places in the continent have the highest rates of poverty, of
Mm.
children and mothers dying, and of instability still to this day.
Yeah.
So that's a really quick history lesson that helps me not shame poor, and I say poor in quotes for the podcasters, poor countries that it might not be of their own fault.
Mm.
They're born into a society or a country that their families were born into, that their families were born into, and there's no way out. It's not like you can just build generational wealth in an unstable country where there's just poverty everywhere. So I think that helps us not shame countries as well and be able to see our privilege. And it also, to me, it anchors the story of Somaliland with Edna a bit more to, 1885, what was happened through power and privilege with unequal consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, I mean, not to, it's a sober reality, and not to spend, to compound that by asking another question in a kind of sobering space. But I know something that helped me in reading through the Science of the Good Samaritan was, you had a chapter and you asked, what is the value of a life?
Yeah.
And you kind of juxtaposed the two doctors involved in being on the front lines of the Ebola outbreak in 2014, and saying it's not just a question of, we're here in North America or Europe and they're over there in Africa or South America or Asia, but it's that even when we go there and are serving in those contexts, we sounds like the wrong term, but even when, North American doctors are serving in Africa, there's still inequities even as they're serving on the front lines. And so could you just quickly share a bit about how that story in your book revealed some of the, I think you could say, structural
Yeah.
injustices in our world, even towards healthcare providers who are serving on the front lines in caring for people who are affected by things like the Ebola outbreak?
Yeah. Yes, and that is the second story that I wanted to share. So that's a great
Yeah,
team with Dr. Khan. I always premise this discussion on that chapter with, this isn't a discourse on medical missions. It's not anti-medical missions. I have great
right.
friends that do that work. It is it is a pause for us to think through, how has some medical missions been done? If it's done with solidarity, which has for a lot of people, that has been their heart, it is a witness.
Mm,
But there is some that is still a, let us come and tell you what needs to be done. There's a, like, an unconscious privilege.
mm,
It's just to take a step and to think through that. The story on the valuing of a life starts with Dr. Khan.
mm,
And I was very specific on who I named in that chapter and who I didn't name, but I wanted to name him. And to give you context of who he is in Africa, he is the Anthony Fauci of the continent. Like,
mm,
people know his name. People at the WHO, at the UN, Dr. Paul Farmer worked with him. He is just very recognized as a physician on the front lines, but also someone who wants to increase preparedness in the healthcare system of the continent. So
mhm,
he was in West Africa even prior to the awful Ebola epidemic that happened there a few years ago. He was at the UN and the WHO asking for, we need to be prepared for if Ebola hits, we are not prepared, and here is what we need. And even talking to Congress about it. That was kind of heard, but not really. It was more of a patchwork, here's a building you could have or something, but not enough. When Ebola hit, he was definitely on the front line. His hospital was. And we all know that story of, or the stories that came out on the news of, how it just barreled through communities. When
mm,
it went through his hospital, he got sick with it. And he not only got sick, he got very sick very quickly. And so they made the decision to send him to a MSF place that was specifically, it's an Ebola containment unit that was equipped for treating it, kind of. And so they sent him there. And once he started deteriorating a little bit more, there was this discussion of, do we give him what's called ZMapp? And what that is, it's an experimental drug at the time, but it was the only thing that could be used that would be like an antidote for Ebola. It was
mm,
it was a treatment that we didn't quite know if it worked, but this is a Hail Mary, to see if it did. The problem with ZMapp is there's only a few vials in the whole world.
mm,
Now, that medical facility at MSF did have a couple of vials right there. And I'm sure the New York Times did a great piece, a very long piece on the intricacies of that conversation of, does he get it? Is he too far gone to benefit from it, or should we at least try? And it was decided not to give it to him. So
Mm.
days later, he passed away with none of his family. One of his friends finally was let in at the very end for him. Now, about 500 miles away, another physician got sick with Ebola. And there were those questions of, do we medevac him out? There was actually a medevac that was asked to get Dr. Khan. And once they got there, they wouldn't take him because he was so sick,
Mm.
like the pilots. But they didn't have the biocontainment things you see on the movies. It was just a plane. So that other physician who got sick with Ebola was medevaced out, and not only medevaced out, he was medevaced on the one you see on the movies, like the
And and
U.S.
this is an African man, or what's the
No,
ethnicity?
this is an American man.
Gotcha.
He works for a very large medical mission group, very well known. And he was medevaced out on that state of the art airplane. I don't know if you remember seeing, I watched it on the news when he landed at the facility and he walks out with just the head to toe biocontainment unit. He was given ZMAP in
Mm.
country, but then also when he came back to the States. And weeks later, he walked out of that hospital alive. So the question is not, to me, who is that man and where did he work? He worked for a medical organization that had really good connections in very high places and a lot of
Mhm.
money, which is
Mhm.
why I'm sure he got that treatment. The question for me was, how do we value a life? What was the difference between him and Dr. Khan to received that ZMAP? And then the bigger question, if you zoom 30,000 feet out, is why isn't there enough of ZMAP or diabetes medication or remdesivir to treat COVID vaccines for everybody? Who
Mm.
gets what? How do we value a life of a country or of a people? And I think that gets to your heart change question of, if we can wrestle with that, and I think really let the Lord probably dig up some things in us that needs to be dug up. I think that helps us be a bigger neighbor because we understand, how do I value a life?
Mm.
How do I value who gets what? And then in my job, hopefully it's working towards, changing that at the United Nations or on a larger scale. But for those of us just on a regular Tuesday with children, I think having those stories and wrestling with it helps us be better parents to raise little neighbors too, because we
Mm.
can talk about it age appropriately with them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sobering, but thank you for sharing that, Emily. And I wonder, maybe to conclude our conversation here, but so many people who are listening, I hope, have been really challenged and helpfully informed by what you said. And there are some listening who might be in a place where like you, they're wanting to work really purposefully to having redemptive, just presence in the world, but they're discouraged. They feel
Yeah.
like they can't see the big picture fruit of their day by day efforts, which maybe just feel like a drop in the bucket. And I know that towards the end of the book, you share the story of the example of Nehemiah and
Yeah.
his focus and his diligence and stepping into a situation that looked like, wow, it's going to take forever to turn this around, but that there are some really great character traits in him that saw that vision carried through. So, for people that have that same kind of vision for redemptive presence and work in the world, what would you point them to in the example of Nehemiah to encourage them in the journey that they're on right now?
Yes, I love that question. And I love the story of Nehemiah because it is the antidote for those of us who are very empathetic and we want to be good neighbors, but you almost get mowed over with, there's too much to do. Like there's, what is my part in the world? And so at the end of chapter 1 in the book of Nehemiah is this fun phrase where he says, and I'm a cupbearer to the king, like this total nonchalant, you know, identity of who he was.
Slides it in there. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But on the margin of that, I have, I was a PhD student in 2016. I was a new mom 2008. Like, who were my identity markers? Because I had
Mm,
10 years of dreaming about wanting to do global health work and not getting there yet. So I kind of thought I'd missed the boat.
mm,
Um, so I just kept holding on to it with that. So then when you flip over to chapter 2, he goes back to rebuild the walls and he rallies the people. And then you get these two, uh, uh, Sanballat and Tobias. Is that right? I call them San and
Tobiah. Yeah.
Tobiah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I've been calling them Tob for too long. Where I
Sorry.
need to, yeah. They uh they get kind of riled up about the wall being rebuilt by Nehemiah and everything he was doing. So they go and they basically say, people are talking poorly about you. Come down and defend yourself. And for a lot of us, we would be like, yeah, I'm coming to defend my honor. He doesn't take the bait, though. He just keeps building. And so they come in with what I think is a sneak attack, and they say something where it's more subtle, where that he's like, come and have coffee with us and let's just talk about what you're doing. It's just hang out. He still doesn't take the bait.
Mm,
He says to me, like a very big anchor to my own life of I'm doing a good work and I'm not coming down.
mm,
And he keeps rebuilding. And so at the end of that story, they rebuild the wall, they rededicate themselves, and then there's this incredible corporate worship. But I think having that, I'm doing a good work and not coming down in the back of our head or on a good old post-it note like I do to look at every day, it helps anchor us in what I can do because I can do my work of children's health and poverty, and it's just a dream to do. But then I can't really do a lot about climate change. I mean, we recycle and all that type of stuff, but bigger picture stuff, I can't do that. Food insecurity in the US, I can't really do that. I mean, you can just go down a list of things where we need heaven on earth in this world that's not here
mm,
yet. And for me, it's recognizing what is my good work that I'm not coming down for, and then linking arms with people that are doing tackling food insecurity or tackling um, poverty or being a mom and just a great parent raising little kids. I just think there's so much value to where God has us each in our season and knowing that that's a good work we're doing and to not come down. So I would say just be encouraged and let God define what that is. It could
mm.
be something extravagant, like where you're traveling to Yemen, or it could just be raising those really sweet little babies to be good neighbors.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Emily. And thanks for what you're doing and for everything you've taken the time to invest in this conversation. And I wonder for people who are listening in and they'd love to learn more about you, they'd love to connect with you online, they'd like to pick up a copy of The Science of the Good Samaritan. Where could they do that?
The books are sold anywhere you love books, so online and your local bookstore. If you do the audio version, I read it, and
Mm.
I have been told I am not very chill in it, which
Makes an interesting read.
yeah, I tear up too much and then get a little excited about it. But I'm also on all the socials as Friendly Neighbor Epidemiologist, so Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And I'm also on Substack where I write
Yeah.
on Tuesdays. I have a Neighbor Tuesday post where I just talk about what does it look like to be a neighbor in this world from
Mm.
lots of different vantage points. So people can subscribe to that too.
Right on. Right on. Well, thank you, Emily. This has been a really insightful time and a really helpful time. So I'm really grateful to you for being willing to jump on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is good.